Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are doing something that is long awaited on this channel. For a long, long time, you have wanted some French army stuff and particularly light infantry. So we're doing the French Sharp, sort of. We might actually call this episode the French Sharp just to really kind of. I'm getting shakes of head from our guest and absolute disgust, but it might work in terms of kind of the clickbait getting people to listen. So maybe this is hello and welcome to French Sharp. But crucially, we're looking at the French Light Infantry today. Joining me in the co-pilot seat, as ever, is the redoubtable Liam Telfer Esquire. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm very well indeed. I'm very well indeed, and I think you see it's well overdue. We got to some French light infantry stuff. As a very Anglo-centric kind of guy, I'm really looking forward to diving into this.
Yes, it is entirely my fault that we haven't managed to do this already. Very sorry, listeners. And we are joined by Terry Crowdy, who's an author with a specialist interest in irregular warfare and intelligence, and is the author of three titles that we're going to flag for you. Details, of course, will be in the descriptions. Marengo, quite obviously the story of the battle and the campaign, which is available from Pen and Sword. Incomparable, Napoleon's Ninth Light Infantry Regiment from Osprey, and French Light Infantry 1784 to 1815, which is available from Hellion. And as I always emphasize, folks, please go and buy direct from the publishers. Terry, lovely to see you. How are you doing? Welcome.
Hi, great to be here. Looking forward to this one.
So, where to begin with this one? I'm going to be unimaginative, and I'm going to sort of go back to the beginning, I guess. Origins of light infantry, particularly bearing in mind that a lot of our listeners perhaps aren't steeped in the history of French military doctrine during this period. What are the origins of light infantry within the French military? And how does that develop in the Royal Army before we get to the Revolution? So, kind of taking it way back to sort of the early years that we cover on this show.
Well, I think, as an opening remark, I was told many years ago that if you want to understand the French army of Napoleon, you have to look at what happened before the revolution. If you think about it, Napoleon was a product of the Ancien regime's military academies. And so he would have, as he was, developing, like all of us, with the things we learn at school and at university and so on, influence how we later think. So if we think about Napoleon's light infantry, we have to go back a fair way. And I suppose the first thing we should state here is, what are light infantry? What do we actually mean? Um, and to understand that, you again, you go all the way back to the classical definitions of, these are missile troops that are fighting outside of the phalanx. So if we go back to ancient Greece and Rome, these are the guys with the bows, the arrows, the slingshots, the javelins, that are not in, in armor with shields, and that are going to, you know, fight with shock action. These are the guys around that. And actually, even if we go into the Napoleonic period, more or less that definition remains. So we're not talking about the troops in the line, in the battle line, in the columns. We're talking about those troops that are operating outside it, skirmishing, scouting, that type of thing. And it's important we do that because the French are incredibly complex in the numbers of types of different light infantry they had. Um, the I suppose the original French light infantry were, the archetypal mountain men during the sort of time of, Louis XVI. Horses don't fight, you can't fight with horses in mountains. You can't fight with massed infantry formations in mountains. You tend to use, the locals. And the French also had this really interesting species of infantry, really, called the enfants perdus, and it means the lost children. Now, I suppose those, what the French would call us Anglo-Saxons, we're used to hearing about a forlorn hope in sieges and stuff like this. Well, the origins of the forlorn hope, I think it comes from Dutch, something like verloren hoop, and it's the lost troops. So it goes back to enfants perdus. And what these guys are, they're actually volunteers. So it's like we have a really, really dangerous mission. Very unlikely you'll survive. But if you do, we will pay you a lot of money or we will promote you. And so actually for the French, it becomes a bit of an object of emulation to the point where they had to almost do it by ballot to see who would actually get these things. And the types of jobs that they might perform are things like throwing grenades at people. So the enfants perdus become the grenadiers. So they're actually kind of an irregular force that becomes regularized as grenadiers. Now, light infantry have a very, very similar pathway to this. So in the 18th century, the mid 18th century, so we're talking about 7 Years' War, which our American cousins will call the French Indian War, and so on. The Habsburgs really unleash this new type of warfare where they have irregular troops recruited from the Balkans, and they just let them loose on enemy supply lines and those types of targets rather than the field army. And the only way you can kind of counter those sorts of troops is to have your own irregulars that go after them and equally go raiding in the enemy territories on your behalf. And so we have what were initially called the partisans. Now we think of partisans today as a kind of very irregular, like the Spanish guerrilla type type of soldier, or not even a soldier, just completely irregular. But again, if you're into your etymology, partisan originally comes from the partie de guerre, so it's a war band. So it's a regular type of soldier, but doing an irregular type of fighting. These eventually they become the legions that under sort of Louis XVI through to Louis XVIII. They're the advanced guards of the regular army, and they become the forerunner of the light infantry regiments we have in the Napoleonic period. But we also have within the actual line infantry regiments some very, very peculiar things happening. So they have the pickets, just a detachment of maybe 50 guys say, okay, you're now scouts. Are you a good shot? Yes, excellent. Right, off you go. They become chasseurs in the infantry regiment. So under, again, going back to the 7 Years' War, every line regiment is starting to form its own chasseur unit, which is I suppose the equivalent in the British Army is the light company. That's what we're talking about here. And these finally become the voltigeurs of the Napoleonic period, which we'll come back to. So we've got this arms race going on where the Habsburgs have unleashed these first light troops, and the French have had to rapidly build up irregular forces. They're also influenced, as I imagine the British are, by what we could call bushfighting tactics in the New World. So, if you have your column of soldiers marching through a woods and someone jumps out from nowhere and whacks you with a tomahawk, how do you deal with that? You can't stop 1,000 men, get them to load their muskets. By the time that's all happened, that these people are long gone. So the French were quite influenced by that, and they were also influenced by the colonial militias, particularly the Americans with their long rifles, the French called them, and even the French Canadians, who they had several examples of the Canadians just shooting columns of redcoats to pieces, before anybody could react to them. And the French were quite, they looked at that and said, hey, that's a good lesson. But ultimately, everything goes back to Frederick the Great of Prussia, who, let's face it, absolutely trounced the French in the 7 Years' War. They said, we've just been beaten by this Prussian army. We're going to be like the Prussian army. And lo and behold, in 1783, Frederick the Great creates his Jaeger units, Jaeger being German for hunter. Next year, the French, in 1784, they form their first chasseur à pied, foot chasseurs. they're hunters. So you've got to see all the build up before the revolution is part of this arms race.
Now, I suppose we can take the next step then, Terry, and looking at the French Revolution. I mean, I suppose it is a hugely tumultuous time for France, full stop, let alone the military. So how do the early events of the French Revolution affect the light infantry and its organization? I guess, do we see a new and profound difference in tactical doctrine, or an overhaul of its leaders? And are we seeing new types of light troops being introduced?
So with the French Revolution in 1789, it comes at a really bad time for the development of light infantry, because in 1788 the French they tweak the way they're going to operate light infantry, and they initially had like a combined arms force of light cavalry, light infantry. In 1788 they split those up, and there are just 12 battalions of light infantry on the on the statutes. But you have to remember, every line battalion had its light company until on the 1st of August 1791, they introduced new drill regulations. And the first thing that happens is they abolish all the light companies. So France is going into the war with 14 battalions of light troops to protect every mountain range on its borders, protect the advance guard of every one of its armies. It's just never going to happen. They're woefully unprepared. On top of this new regulation coming in, there's no mention of skirmishing in it. Doesn't feature anywhere. So there's no tactic that the French can follow. It was back in 1769, a fellow called Dumouriez, who ends up leading one of the early armies in the revolution. He wrote a regulation for light infantry, but it was ignored, and so it was just never adopted. So the only real mention that they have is in 1792. There's a new set of field service regulations, and they mention that there are light infantry, and the only advice it offers them is, well, perhaps we can send our chasseurs up to kill enemy gun crews. That's it. So there's no doctrine at all. We've got these, you know, on the eve of war, they actually push it up to 14 battalions, and then all the officers start to leave because of the majority of the officers by law had to be from the nobility. The French nobles are under threat. The king's being, after he tried to flee France in 1791, he's now under arrest and about to be guillotined. It's utter chaos. So you've got a lot of the officers are either leaving because they're terrified of staying in their own country, or they're looking at things and saying, hey, hang on a minute, I can get promoted to one of the big line regiments here because all their officers have fled. And so you end up with this terrible situation where what's left of these light infantry battalions are now being commanded by sergeants who really have no experience beyond instructing a platoon of soldiers. And that's what they go to war with. And you can imagine the results. When they first start encountering Austrian troops, and the Austrians, as I sort of mentioned in the first part there, they were the ones that started this revolution in advanced guard warfare. When the French come up against them, they're just shot to pieces. The Austrians have got rifles, they're really well trained. The French guys have got no concept of maneuvering. There's nothing in their drill book about hiding behind trees and making use of cover and running away if you're being, surrounded. So they just stand there training, firing away as they've been trained, like line infantry. And, it's a disaster. So very, very quickly, people realize what's happening back in Paris, and we start seeing dozens of units of free corps, of what they called legions. So these are these mixed force of horses and foot troops. And these people are incredibly patriotically motivated because they put out their call of La Patrie en danger, that the homeland's in danger, the fatherland's in danger. And you've got a choice, really. You can go into a line regiment and stand there and let someone fire cannons at you, or you can go into one of these freewheeling light infantry units that's being created. Um, and, the service with light troops becomes billed as something that's the most patriotic thing you can do, because you're the ones that are going to be fighting the enemy most. You're the ones up at the front on the forward posts. Um, and yeah, it's actually billed as a really exciting thing to do. And initially they don't really know what they're doing, but they just flood the advance guard with soldiers, and those that survive that initial baptism of fire against the Austrians and then the Prussians actually start to become very good at what they're doing. And you have this really interesting dynamic in France where you've got this kind of new species of fighting with social mobility added to it. So if you're a young, energetic, chap, you can be elected as an officer. You can get a reputation. If you're actually bringing success, people will notice you. And you have to think in the 1790s in France of soldiers as they're the rock stars of their day. The entire country is focused on these patriots defending them from invasion. So, you look at this and you go, if you're one of these young officers, there's no glass ceiling on promotion. Everybody ahead of you's run. The generals, the senior officers, they fled France. So you can go anywhere you want with your career if you're lucky, if you survive it, and if you're up at the front. And so you see officers and generals even up at the skirmish lines directing their men, run here, do this, do that. And it's an incredibly exciting period. As I say, this starts to overwhelm the Austrians and the Prussians because it's just the sheer volume of manpower France is throwing into this type of warfare. It just becomes unmanageable for the enemy.
In many respects, that's sort of a fundamental aspect of the early phase of the war and the revolution's survival, right? Just sheer weight of numbers and France's ability to take punishment and force the allies into situations where they have to pull back because they can't hold off the sort of the gathering hordes almost. When it comes to the people who are driving some of this change, do we know of individuals, or is it sort of done um, because there kind of develops this sort of sense of a way of doing things, right? But how does that come together, particularly with sort of an eye on sort of the sense of catastrophe and impending doom that comes with the early phase of the Revolutionary Wars?
I think just to pick up your sort of opening remark there, I believe France had the youngest, biggest population in Europe in 1789. So while the revolution came at a bad time for the development of light infantry, it came at a natural time where you have a momentum. So France has the youngest, largest population in Europe in 1791. There's just this momentum for change. And when the revolution starts to unlock that, when the glass ceiling I mentioned is removed, it's, people can go anywhere and they can do stuff. And I think, if you look at Austria, Austria always has its as its flag suggested at the time, it's looking west towards France, it's looking east as well towards Russia and also to the Habsburg. It's got an empire to manage. The French don't have to worry about this. It's just this huge momentum, social mobility through their armed forces. And early on, for I'd say the first half of the 1790s, there is no theoretical thinking of what they are doing. It's purely, right, do you have a gun? Do you have ammunition? Right, let's go up there and let's do something. And it's incredibly dynamic. It's something, it would almost be fun to war game this, where you could start sticking generals right at the front and say, okay, general gets shot. Do the troops go insane with rage and perform even better, or do they run away? Do they? There's all sorts of little dynamics you could look at in the sort of what we call the petty guerre, the little war, the petty war that's happening on the front lines. But an interesting thing happens in Italy. So before Napoleon takes over the army of Italy, there's a general there, Scherer, and he's a really interesting guy. He sets up all the intelligence networks that Napoleon later uses, using Italian revolutionaries and so on. And he starts to think about light infantry warfare because, as you know, the border between France and Italy has got it's the Alps. So you need to fight in that irregular style. But once you cross over into Italy, you're in that great Po Basin. It's an enormously flat area. And he starts thinking, well, how are we going to fight once we actually go into Italy? And so he starts writing some interesting instructions to his troops. And an interesting thing is that the French drill manual from 1791, I think they're still using that in the 1830s. They don't change it. So rather than you getting formal regulations coming out, what tends to happen in the French army is a general will write an instruction to his officers and say, this is how I want you to do it here. And Scherer comes up with this concept that if you take your light infantry, let's say you have a battalion of light infantry, or by then we're talking half brigade, so we're talking a de facto regiment of 3 battalions. He's saying we normally form up in 3 ranks. Well, the third rank can't do anything. So I want all my light infantry to form up in 2 ranks, and I want them to form a screen in front of me with maybe a 2 to 5 pace gap between each file of men, so that anyone shooting at them is scoring less hits. And he said the line infantry, no shooting, no messing around. I want you all in attack columns. So this is like 2 companies frontage, 4 sort of companies deep. So you're looking at a great block of men. And he's saying, I want my attack columns to just follow this skirmish screen. And the skirmish screen almost forms a smoke screen. If you think once they start firing, and then it's all about then the shock action happens, that literally the skirmishers jump out of the way and the columns come through and smash into you. And then it's hand-to-hand fighting. You should know, and it's something we'll come back to, the French don't get firearms. It's the French want shock action, because and actually there are examples that bear this out. They say if we stand there shooting at each other, you're going to cause as many hits as I'm going to cause, and I'm just going to lose my men. So the only way we're going to get you out of the way is we're physically going to occupy the ground you're standing in. And so everything is about getting the line infantry to that point where they can charge you. So the light infantry, as you can see, are just they are being told go after enemy gunners if they can. But in a sense, rather than it being this free for all that we see in the early part of the 1790s, we're now looking at an open order, line 3 battalions wide. This is huge coming at you, and what's coming behind it. So it's a really, really interesting concept. Nothing new in it. The Marshal de Saxe, he's talking about the same thing back in the 1750s. He describes it exactly. Don't worry about these troops shooting. Just get in there and get in with the bayonet. But the thing they start to recognize is that a soldier that's in the skirmish line, if he can load and fire at will, he has time to aim. And so the French concept is that we can still keep up the speed of fire, but by separating people, we can, we can improve the accuracy of the number of hits. And so again, it's the innovation that starts to come through, and others, they don't document it in the way that Scherer did, but it's the scale again. We're not talking a company of light troops. We're talking battalions of them just coming at you at extreme speed and firing all the way.
Now, I want to just jump forward slightly, Terry, and we're going to bring in our main man. I was going to say General Bonaparte then, but let's give him his proper title, Emperor Napoleon the First, and the First Empire. Now, how does Napoleon? It's not like him not to get stuck into things or put his nose where it doesn't belong. How does he take on the organization and implementation of light infantry warfare? Do we have any evidence, for example, of his thoughts on light troops and the use of light troops, or any changes that he made to the light infantry arm?
This may be a slightly controversial viewpoint on this, but for me, the jury's out with Napoleon and light infantry. I don't think he quite gets them. And if you actually look at the evidence, a lot of what Napoleon does as emperor is to actually return the French army back to the state it was in before the revolution, even down to battalion structures and so on. And as I said before, it's the Royal Army is where Napoleon made, that's where he learned his craft. So the other thing to think about is at heart, he's an artilleryman. I think with Napoleon, if we look at a lot of his big battles, it's all about the mass, isn't it? It's this kinetic shock, big battalions, all those things that Clausewitz thinks are important, but which, if you think about it, are slightly ludicrous. Just it's all about just massing people in one point, and hopefully you have more people than they do. But when you think about it, if your army supply lines are being terrorized by Cossacks or Spanish guerrillas and all these things, and you're having to fortify outposts and leave garrisons behind, your main army suffers. So Napoleon does create the voltigeurs. So he restores to the French army this concept that every battalion of line troops will have a light company. Nothing new there. The French have been doing it since, the 1750s. And as I say, it was only until 1791 that they actually removed that unit from each battalion. So he brings the French back to how they were before the revolution. And there is an innovation here. It's generally recognized that the shortest men make the best light infantry. They don't need to eat as much. They are typically faster marchers, stronger, more robust. They present smaller targets. They can climb in and out of thickets and get into things that a 6-footer would struggle with. And this is all written down in various theoretical books at the time when they're trying to understand this. And Napoleon, he 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 notices something here. So when he creates the voltigeurs, he changes the height requirement for infantry. And so he lowers it down to the voltigeurs have to be under 5 foot French. Now, a French foot's bigger than an English foot. So if you're 5 foot, you're actually probably about 5'4", 5'5". So he lowers the height requirement, which actually now brings him, I've forgotten the number, it's something like an extra 60,000 potential recruits he can conscript into his army. So it's genius, really. And not only do these guys who, the previous week were technically military unfit for service, not only are they now fit for service, he says, you're elite troops. He had a certain way of doing things. And he creates these units that essentially what he's trying to achieve, I think the French had already done on a kind of an unofficial basis, that every battalion had its éclaireurs, the scouts that it could use for scouting or for skirmishing. But the other thing is he in 1808 there's a massive reorganization in French infantry. And he does retain light infantry. He doesn't break them up. He doesn't say, actually, you're indistinguishable now from line infantry. I'm just getting rid of you. He does keep them. So there must have been something. There must have been something about light infantry which was different from the line infantry.
So the inevitable thing that people tend to talk about that I am going to hurl into this conversation. Yes, I'm going to have my Bernard Cornwell Sharp moment, 95th Rifles, the Baker rifle, all of that. The French don't use rifles. And everybody turns around and says, this is because of Napoleon. And he thinks that there's a much more powerful argument to be made that in the time that it takes to reload, you can close the distance. And then, it doesn't matter if you've got a rifle or a musket. If you're close enough, you can hit something or you can suppress their fire with sheer weight of lead. Firstly, is that assessment fair? I.e., it's Napoleon who hamstrings any attempt for the French to get involved with the rifle? And how much of an impact do you think that really has on the combat effectiveness of the French light infantry?
I think for me, the French experiment with rifles is really, really interesting. Right at the beginning, I said revolution comes at a bad time. They're just starting to experiment with rifles. And the way they originally did it is in each light infantry company, 6 men, their best shooters, their sharpshooters, were given rifles. And they would, basically you've got a unit here of guys skirmishing, and then you've got your 6 marksmen who are the guys really picking out stuff. So you get that combination, and I think many of the German states had this mixture where you have a mixture of standard infantry muskets, so you can keep up the rate of fire, and then you've got that combination of accuracy from the 6 guys there. So that just doesn't take off. And there's two reasons for that. One, I think, is technological. The French, I don't think they could produce enough standardization in the manufacture of the rifles, because you've got the barrel of the rifle itself has got these 7 spirals in it. There's a very influential writer, General Duhem, and he says that almost every single rifleman had to carry his own lead mold that was exact for that one weapon. And he said, so you'd spend the entire day fighting, and then you have to spend the night literally casting your own ammunition for the next day. So I think there's technological problems there, but there was a mentality problem, and it's almost comical when you think about it. The reason the French didn't adopt the rifle is because they didn't like the bayonet that attached to it. And to the French, the bayonets are everything. And they can't get beyond this mindset of the whole point of combat is to close with the enemy with the bayonet. Well, no, if you've got a rifle, you can stand away from them and you can shoot at them. No, 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 but we use the bayonet. And they found that when they experimented with bayonets, that these were getting snapped too easily. And it got down to the point where they were saying that the riflemen are effectively disarmed because we've given them rifles. And the French riflemen demand their old infantry muskets back. Now, in Napoleon's head, there's a quote in the Helium book about this. He thought the infantry musket was the most perfect weapon ever devised, and he lists all these wonderful things you can do with it, 60 shots without it failing, and the rate of fire, how quickly you can pick up and use these things. And I think from Napoleon's point of view, he did think that, yes, let's stick with that primary infantry weapon. But again, with the voltigeur units, he said, let's give them to the NCOs. Let's give rifles to the NCOs. And I know from other research that a lot of the officers carried rifles as well. But again, it's their mindset. It's they want to close. It was actually very similar at sea. the French naval tactics were all about boarding the enemy ship. Yeah, can we board the enemy ship and take it as a prize? Fantastic. Whereas as the English approach to it was, let's just blow the hell out of the thing before it gets anywhere near us.
Now, I want to sort of stick with that theme of kit a little bit. I am the quartermaster after all, and I love me some swag. So I guess we can probably do this both ways. You mentioned things about the different kinds of firearms, but is there any sort of marked difference in the way that light infantry were armed in comparison to the line regiments as a whole? And does this differ with the Imperial Guard again, as it were? And we could also throw into there the sort of distinguishing marks and features of light infantry. You know, the thing that always springs to mind in my little Anglo-centric tower is, you know, for instance, light companies wore green plumes as opposed to the red and white of centre companies. So, what kind of distinguishing features do we see that set the French light infantry apart?
I think there is a definite difference in the appearance of French light infantry. And someone who's studied it, and has an affection with that. They styled their uniforms very much on the look of light cavalry, and they had a certain swagger about them. So, but a lot of the uniform was based on practicalities. So think about the line infantry for the minute. What do you want your line infantryman to do? You want him to stand completely immobile while someone fires cannons at him for 8 hours. So everything about them is to generate this sense of an immobile mass. With light infantry, they wear short gaiters. Initially, they're cut to resemble the Hungarian boots that hussars wear. The French typically had a long tail coat in through most of the period, so the tails of the coat are coming down behind your knee. It looks all very elegant, but if you're trying to climb through bushes and you've got your coat tail snagging, that's not very practical. So light infantry very quickly adopt the short-tailed jacket, and eventually they adopt what I suppose the English would call like a Spencer type jacket. They call it the Habby vest. So it's a jacket coat, which rather than having a waistcoat exposed across the belly there, with like a towel coat does, it closes square across the waistline. And but the big thing I think is it's the emblems that light infantry are wearing. So whereas I think if you look at your sharp type characters, they have a bugle. In France, it was the corps de chasse, so it's a hunting horn, and that was the traditional instrument of the hunt. And the French wanted to associate themselves with that noble art of hunting. Even the common soldier was given um, the short sword. So before the revolution, they were called a grenadier saber. And actually, before the revolution, French chasseurs did wear a green coat. It was only during after the revolution where, if you think about it, in France, the flag is the national identity. So they wanted people to be dressed in red, white, and blue. But although you see light infantry is predominantly dark blue that they're wearing. But before the revolution, they were dressed in green, and they look smart. Interesting things though start to happen. So this after about 1807, they're told to give their swords back because they're not really not really different anymore. They're just like normal line infantry. I think the sergeants and things could keep them, and the uniform start to become homogenized. You have the famous regulations that come out in 1812, which realistically only are implemented by the time of Waterloo, and even them not completely. And then it's a standard uniform really between light infantry and line infantry. The only difference being white lapels in the line and blue lapels in the light. And equally, if you go to the Imperial Guard, because the Imperial Guard had light infantry as well as line infantry, it was symbolic more than anything else. they dressed the same. They very, very little difference just in the plume colours. Because it was a guard unit. It wasn't the Imperial Guard really wasn't until towards the end of the war, wasn't really a fighting force as such. It's a weird organization because actually what it's doing, it's sucking all the best troops out of the line into it. There you've got this kind of brain drain of all the best soldiers are being pulled out of their regiments. And of course they want to go because they're going to get better pay and there's less chance of them being in action. So it's, yeah, as I say, it's initially very pronounced, and then it, like everything else, I think in this subject, it homogenizes.
Can we have a little think about, again, perhaps I'm kind of too influenced by sort of Anglo-centricism and particularly sort of knowing the reputation of particularly the 95th, but also the light infantry units generally in the British Army. There sort of seems to be this sense of elitism that I think is perhaps more handed down to us from the sources. Reputationally, is there some kind of elitism? We've been talking about the Imperial Guard and that kind of brain drain, but is there a sense that, well, if you're not going to the Guard, you might want to go to the light infantry? Is there that kind of reputational kind of draw?
I think there is, and I'll give you an example. So there's one of the memoirists from the Ninth Light Infantry, a guy Giraud, and he had a very influential father who was a politician. So he went off and he did his, he went to Saint Cyr to do his, go through military academy. And he looking to join the army in 1806. And he is initially posted to a line regiment that's doing garrison duty somewhere on the Dutch coast. And he writes to his father and says, I'm not going to see any action here. Get me in a light infantry unit. I think the real crux of the matter here, what's the difference between line and light infantry? It's mentality. So in the line infantry, as I keep saying, your purpose is to fight either by shock action or just stand there and take punishment. Be that granite redoubt out in the field, holding off all enemies. Light infantry, I think even towards the end of the period, they're the unit that marches at the front of the division. So your cavalry goes off scouting. When your cavalry hits the enemy, finds it, it's your light infantry unit that marches through the night to get up there to support them, to hold the ground, while the main infantry units with the artillery and everything come up behind you. So they have this esprit de corps, I think, where they probably elevated themselves in their heads over other units. Certainly in the voltigeurs, I think, they were labelled elite. They were given additional pay. And one of the things the French would do that was interesting is they would amalgamate all these voltigeurs into like composite battalions. So on the day of battle, they would get all the voltigeurs out. And then from all the voltigeurs, they would say, right, now we're going to create like a little advanced guard unit of voltigeurs. Right, who are the three most senior officers out of all of us? Right, we're the best of the best of the best. And then, right, we're going to lead the attack. So they had that kind of mentality. And I think that the light infantry mentality goes all the way back to the partisan warfare of the mid 18th century, which is I'm gonna rely on my speed of thought, my initiative. I'm going to make decisions on my own of what I do in a way that line infantry just don't do that. They stand there and then someone says, do this, do that. So there is this mindset difference between line and light infantry, which I think remains. That said, even some of the celebrity regiments, so the Ninth Light Infantry were named incomparable for their performance at Marengo, where paradoxically their great moment was formed up as line infantry doing a bayonet charge against the Austrians and stopping the Austrian advance, but skip over that. but it sort of said towards the end of the war in Spain, and by now, the quality of these soldiers is not what it was. They would Other regiments would go, oh, it's the incomparables, is it? And it would be almost an object of ridicule that they had this special title. So I don't know. I think um, in the British Army, you have that regimental spirit, don't you? That your regiment is better than any other regiment, regardless of who they are or whatever. In France, it works slightly differently because the object of emulation was the Imperial Guard. So if you're not in that, you're always going to feel slightly inferior to it. There's a funny anecdote. The symbol of elitism. So this was their hanger, their little short sword sidearm thing. They used to be called the Grenadier saber. And if you have one of these, you've got a little sword, and they're quite useful. Cut down bracken and stuff. You're trying to get your way through to the enemy. It's handy having a little short sword there. And sometime in the early 1790s, the early 1800s, they changed the shape of the Grenadier saber. So rather than a square hilt, it had a curved hilt. And a guy in the Ministry of War said, "What do they call those little short swords? The infantry carry, or some of the infantry carry." And the guy called them a briquet. And this guy was a cavalryman. And the guy thought, briquet, that's a funny name for it. So briquet is, if you look up briquet now, it's like a cigarette lighter is a briquet. But then it was a tinder striker. And if you've ever seen a Napoleonic tinder striker, it's like a kind of a knuckle duster with a circular hilt. And these new hilts look like tinder strikers. And what this is going on is the cavalryman with his great big sword is going, yeah, he's got a sword, but it's a tinder striker. And that went into the official lexicon of French military terms.
Right, Terry, it's coming close to wrapping, but I've got one final question for you. And yeah, we're not one for sitting on the fence here, and it's going to put you on the spot somewhat. So, and it is purely your opinion, so you can go on record and no one's going to come after you. Or maybe they will, but we'll see. So in your opinion, then, of course, and looking at, we know so many different nationalities did light infantry, the French, the British, the Prussians, you mentioned. Pretty much everybody was doing it in some form or another. Who did it best? Which army used their light troops to the greatest overall effect or impact? And yeah, just give us which one is the best in your opinion.
Well, I think starting on the fence, it's a question of when. So at the beginning, we know the Austrians are the best because they're doing it. At the end of the 1790s, when you get the invasion scare, and the Brits are sitting there thinking Napoleon's coming across the channel in 1802, 3, 4. If you look at a lot of the British texts, they're saying this is how the French fight. They fight as light infantry, and we've got to match it. So I'd go Austrians to start, that consular era, early empire, the French have got it. But by the end of the wars, you have to take your hats off to the British, I think. We adapt in our glorious tradition. We started off the war completely unprepared, but by the end of it, we're pretty good. And I think that's it. The British innovated and carried on innovating in a way that I think the French didn't.
That's an interesting thought on which to end. I suspect some of our listeners will be shouting into their podcast device of choice with counterpoints and all the rest of it on that. But we'll let you do that in the comments, folks. If you agree, if you disagree with Terry's assessment there, please do dive into the comments if you're listening to this on Spotify and let us know what you think. Terry, massive thank you for your time on this one. Folks, you've been listening to Terry Crowdy, the author of Marengo, available from Pen and Sword, Incomparable, Napoleon's 9th Light Infantry Regiment, available from Osprey, and French Light Infantry 1784 to 1815, available from Hellion, and we will put the links in the description. Terry, massive thank you once again. My thanks as ever to my co-host Liam. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news from the show, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-May 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, and in the Legion to Scholars tier, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.